Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today. Welcome to the Korea-U.S. Policy Dialogue on Political Polarization. My name is Grace Kim. I'm a program coordinator of KDI School's International Cooperation team. Today, we're joined by the leading experts in the field of politics, economics, and communications to discuss about the political polarization. We really appreciate your time to attend our event today. The event will take place over 2 days, today and tomorrow, and it's being broadcasted live on YouTube streaming with participants across the world. Thank you all for joining. We're looking forward to your active participation. We would like to begin the event with the opening speech delivered by Dean Jong-il Yu of KDI School of Public Policy and Management. Please welcome Dean Yu of KDI School on the screen. Thank you.
Good morning and good evening, everyone. As the host of this Korea-U.S. Policy Dialogue, and on behalf of KDI School of Public Policy and Management, I'd like to extend my warmest welcome to all of you. It's a great pleasure and an honor to be a part of this meaningful dialogue among distinguished scholars from the US and South Korea. I'm grateful to all the participants for taking the time to share your valuable insights, and to the organizers for putting together an excellent program like this. KDI School began hosting a Korea-U.S. Policy Dialogue last year, just before the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic, as one of our public diplomacy initiatives. Our first policy dialogue was held in January last year in Washington, D.C., and I was there. We had insightful and enjoyable discussions on trade protectionism and changes in the global value chains. Because of the pandemic, there was a little bit of hiatus, and this is our second policy dialogue. What we hope to achieve through this dialogue is scholarly discussions on topics of mutual interest and concern in Korea and the United States, thereby deepening our understanding of the topic with the benefit of a comparative perspective, and also identifying areas in which the two countries can cooperate more fruitfully, and ultimately improving our bilateral relations with a deeper understanding of the perspectives of each other. History has shown us that many unnecessary and avoidable difficulties stem from misunderstandings. I believe the Korean side has had some misguided expectations for the United States, and the US side has at times mishandled Korea-related issues because of insufficient understanding of each other's history, culture, and society. I believe scholarly discussions like this are not going to produce immediate results, but it will, in the longer term, help improve our bilateral relations. I can't overemphasize the importance of today's topic. In my view, political polarization in the US, Korea, and many other countries around the world is a deadlier problem than the COVID-19 pandemic itself. It cripples our responses to the pandemic and other acute problems, undermines political stability, and even threatens democracy itself. I suppose I speak for a majority of the Korean people when I say how shocking it was to see the disputes over the outcome of the presidential election in the US last year, and especially the riot at the Capitol Hill on the 6th of January. For Koreans, the US was not only an economic benefactor to us, but also a beacon of democratic hope for us. What happened? Why is this happening? What's going to happen in the future? A lot of Koreans have been asking these questions lately. In this context, a severe political polarization is considered to be a crucial factor, given that there's plenty of political polarization going on in Korea, we are worried about the future of Korean democracy too. So I hope today's discussions will throw light on important aspects of political polarization in the two countries. What are the connections between political polarization and economic polarization? What are the roles played by political institutions and media in exacerbating political polarization? How can we overcome these problems and strengthen democracy? What are the commonalities and differences between the two countries? What can we learn from each other? So many interesting and important questions are in front of us. I very much look forward to your presentations and discussions today, and hope to learn from you. And once again, thank everyone for your contribution. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dean Yu, for your opening speech. Now we'll begin the very first session of the event today on elite polarization. If you have any questions or comments, please post them on YouTube live chat room, and we'll be answering your questions during the Q&A after the presentations. Allow me to introduce the moderator for the session 1, Professor Won-Hyuk Im from KDI School. Professor Im received his PhD in economics in Stanford University and had served as director of the Center for International Development and the executive director of the Center for Regulatory Studies in KDI. I'd like to turn the program to Professor Lim. Please welcome.
Well, thank you for the introduction. As Dean Yu mentioned, the objective of Korea-U.S. policy dialogue is to enhance the mutual understanding of the two countries by looking at topics of mutual interest from a comparative perspective. As you know, when people talk about Korea in the United States, it usually has to do with the Korean Peninsula, North Korea. And some also talk about K-pop and stuff. But I believe there are many issues that are of mutual interest to Korea and the United States that are not discussed to a sufficient extent in the United States and in Korea. And as Dean Yu mentioned, we looked at trade protectionism and the future of global trade last year as the first topic for our inaugural Korea-U.S. policy dialogue. And the topic for the second dialogue is political polarization. And when I contacted Professor Nolan McCarty last summer, we were interested in looking at this problem of political polarization from a comparative perspective, especially given that the two countries have a presidential system, unlike most other democracies. But also at the same time, we knew there are important differences between the two countries. So we thought it would be good to look at this issue from a comparative angle and extract some insights by doing so. And our dialogue today and tomorrow consists of 4 sessions. We'll kick off with session 1 on elite polarization or political polarization among the politicians and other political elite. And then we'll follow in session 2, voter polarization, mass polarization or opinion polarization of the general public. And tomorrow in session 3, we'll look at the political economy aspects of polarization on things like campaign financing, interest group politics, and voter preferences as revealed through experiments. And finally, in the last session, session 4, we'll look at the impact of internet media on polarization and vice versa. So we'll cover a number of interesting topics on polarization. And for session 1 on elite polarization, we have 2 distinguished speakers. Professor Nolan McCarty at Princeton University and Professor Kyu-Sup Han at Seoul National University. Professor McCarthy will give a presentation on polarization and governance in the United States and Korea. And Professor Han with Sang-Bum Kim, that's also at Seoul National University, will provide a first empirical look at the rise of elite polarization in Korea. Each speaker will have 15 minutes for presentation, and we'll follow up with a Q&A and discussion after the presentations. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Professor McCarthy to give his presentation. Okay. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. It's been a great pleasure to be part of this project and this dialogue. You know, it's been a great learning experience for me, and I hope that my remarks on my paper can contribute to that dialogue. My topic of my paper really picks up on some of the themes that Dean Yu mentioned, especially what are the potentially pernicious effects of polarization. Ultimately, we care about its effects on democracy and democratic stability, but a kind of an intermediate is its effects on governance, because poor governance is also a major contributor to democratic instability and democratic dissatisfaction. So what I sought to do was to kind of compare both levels of elite partisan polarization in the two countries, and then try to draw out some implications for the similarities and differences between the two countries based on a set of kind of institutional analyses. To cut to the chase, I think I have relatively good news for South Korea, and that, you know, many of the factors which have exacerbated the problems of polarization in the United States are less likely to be a problem, both because of the nature of political polarization in South Korea and the nature of its political institutions. So that's the punchline if you don't want to stick around for the rest. Let me just start, you know, the framing. You know, there's been a considerable loss of confidence in democracy in the United States. And we see this in public opinion polling. You know, support for various democratic values has somewhat eroded. We also, as was mentioned earlier, see this in the aftermath of the 2020 election, you know, where, you know, significant numbers of American voters believe that the election outcomes were fraudulent in some way, and that's become a point for rallying and mobilizing certain types of voters. So one of the points I want to make here to kind of tie this in is that, you know, this period of time in which we had this sort of declining support and confidence in both the procedures and the outputs of American democracy correspond to levels of high political polarization. So throughout my talk, I'm mostly going to talk about elite polarization, you know, polarization of the parties and their representatives in Congress. I won't go into this in too much detail, but here's a standard measure that I've used, that other political science use to measure polarization in both of our national legislative assemblies, the House of Representatives and the Senate. And as you can see, you know, the punchline is, at least in terms of partisan behavior in these institutions, there's been a 40-year period of increasing polarization. I believe the next paper, the next panelists will sort of discuss similar measures for Korea. So this is what I'm talking about, polarization. It's been going upwards for 40 years, and has probably contributed to this dissatisfaction, increasing dissatisfaction in democracies. There's a variety of reasons why this is true. One is the partisanship, the partisan debates may turn off voters and reinforce the idea that problems aren't solvable in a pluralistic, compromising way. You know, second, and perhaps more important, polarization provides, you know, elite actors both opportunities and incentives to attack democratic institutions and the underlying norms. But the one I wanted to talk mostly about is the ways in which polarization combined with a set of institutional arrangements can create considerable challenges for good governance. Okay, so polarization itself may not be either good or bad. It really depends within the institutional context for which it resides. So in the US, one of the reasons why we think partisan polarization presents difficult challenges for governance is because we rely on a set of supermajoritarian institutions such as bicameralism, the requirement of presentment and passage of legislation through both houses and the signature of the president, as well as some features of our Senate, which requires super majorities. So creating supermajorities that are large enough to pass legislation requires some level of bipartisanship because either party is rarely in the position to pass things on its own. A second underappreciated factor about the United States is the extent to which each of the parties themselves are internally factionalized, which is a feature of the American system where party leaders have very little control over nominations, and there's no procedures for competence in dissolution. Therefore, it's very hard to discipline extreme factions within each party. So to pass laws, we need unification of one party plus part of another party, but the internal dynamics are not very conducive to that. And then another feature that's important here is that in a very polarized environment, in a presidential system such as ours, legislators become advocates for the president of their own party or opponents of the opposition party rather than legislators who negotiating with each other as equals. And each of these things have led to major effects. So I obviously won't have the time to go into the data on the US in too much detail, but there's considerable evidence acquired over the years of at least three important effects on governance. One is that legislative output has declined, especially when you control for the demand for legislative output. So there are a lot of problems in the United States for which a legislative solution would be desirable, but have not occurred, dealing with issues such as gun violence, climate change, inequality, several other issues have festered for a very long time without Congress being able to address them. On a more kind of regular basis, we observe the failures of the appropriation process. We do not, we require that new appropriations bills be passed before October 1st each fiscal year. That almost never happens, and the government is continuously operating under an ad hoc system of continuing appropriations. And sometimes this breaks down, and we have government shutdowns, which bring government activity to a standstill. And then a third point is that we see dramatic fights over executive branch nominations and judicial nominations, which lead to the hollowing out of our administration and great numbers of vacancies within the courts. Okay, so those are some of the things that we've found in the U.S. So let me talk then about South Korea, whether there's evidence of such patterns or whether even we should expect such patterns. So as we'll see during the dialogue over the next two nights, there is some evidence that polarization is growing in South Korea. So here's a few examples of citations that are in the paper, and in one of the next paper will present some more evidence on this. So there's some evidence of elite polarization derived from voting in the National Assembly. And there's also some work of surveys of National Assembly legislators that suggest a growing polarization. So there is this, at least the green offshoots of the types of polarization in South Korea that we've observed in the US. And so one of the questions I try to address is whether we should expect the same types of negative outcomes. So on the plus side, why we should expect to have some similarities is that the United States and South Korea do share a lot of important institutional similarities. Clearly, they're both presidential systems, with a president that's separately elected from the national assemblies. They both rely heavily on non-concurrent elections in that in Korea, the entire National Assembly is elected in a year in which there's no presidential election. In the US, we rotate between a concurrent election and a midterm election. So we oftentimes have non-concurrent elections, but not always. And so there's that similarity which kind of breaks the connection between presidential outcomes and congressional outcomes, which can lead to partisan conflict. Third, while the Korean National Assembly is unicameral, so we don't have the issue of bicameralism and the lack of bicameral agreement, it does rely increasingly on supermajoritarian rules for the passage of lots of its legislation. And my rudimentary understanding of that is that the supermajority rules were put in place to actually make it easier to pass legislation, because consensus rules in previous national assemblies were even worse in terms of promoting gridlock. And then a fourth feature that that both countries share in common is increasing political decentralization. I'll talk a little bit about this in the US, but there's been a devolution of authority in South Korea, which might lead to other manifestations of polarization. So now let me say why South Korea is different. I mean, it's different in lots of ways, but my paper highlights three of them. The first is that the legislative and budgetary powers of the Korean president help to offset the effects of polarization on gridlock. So the Korean president has what we call true proposal power. They can make proposals and force legislators to vote on them. American presidents can propose things, but they can't force a vote, and they can't prevent the House or the Senate from amending the legislation in a variety of ways before they take it up. So this presidential authority presumably will helps to keep some efficiency in terms of the passage of the legislation in Korea. The second thing that comes out of the entire project, I don't have any evidence on it here, but it's talked about in several other papers, is that Korean polarization seems to be much more based on social and regional differences than on policies. Now, while these social differences, regional differences can make compromise difficult, at least they're not in a situation where the policy differences are non-negotiable. And in terms of the decentralization, there's less of a concern, I would say, in Korea, given that there's less sovereignty of the subnational units than there is in the US. Whereas, in the US, as we saw during the COVID crisis, the disjunctures between the national government and the state governments were a major impediment to a unified response. Okay, so I had some data in the paper just to make these points. Again, the lack of concurrent elections means that the share of the president's party in the U.S. House of Representatives or the Korean National Assembly is often less than half. Some data on the propensity for polarization to reduce legislative output, in Congress. Unfortunately, we don't have, in terms of assessing the effects of gridlock, we don't have the same types of data for South Korea that we have in the US in order to sort of test directly whether or not there's a gridlock effect of polarization. There's a lot of sort of qualitative work on South Korea indicating that gridlock is a problem for Korea, and that many very important issues do not get addressed by the National Assembly in the same way that very many important issues in the US don't get addressed. But there's no analysis comparable to that of the United States where we can actually measure the output of significant laws and correlated with polarization. But as my institutional analysis suggests, that there are a couple of reasons why we should expect this to be less of a problem in Korea. Again, the formal proposal power of the president in developing legislation, enforcing votes is extremely important. And the higher levels of party discipline seen in the National Assembly makes it much easier for the legislative process to take place with executive leadership. On the budgeting issue, there's also less of a problem in South Korea because of the procedures there. In the U.S., we expect a president to submit a budget. They don't always do it, but we expect them to. In Korea, the executive has to submit a budget. And it's very binding. It's very binding on the National Assembly in terms of what they can do. They can't spend more than the budget allows or create new items of expenditure. So the executive budget is passed almost completely intact. 0.2 percentage point difference in fiscal 2020. But more important in the comparison to the U.S. is that the National Assembly does not pass a budget. The president's constitutionally authorized to continue spending at the previous level. Therefore, there's no government shutdowns in Korea, such as those that we've observed in the United States. I think, how much time do I have left?
You have about 5 more minutes.
Okay, 5 more minutes. Okay, perfect. So we talk a little bit about national local conflicts, because I think this is one of the very interesting developments in the U.S. It could be potentially a problem in Korea if devolution were to continue. So a lot of my recent work on the U.S. is focused on the ways in which polarization manifests itself in terms of conflict between the national and state governments, especially given that in the United States, many more state governments have single party control, either completely Democratic control or complete Republican control. So that means that many states are going to be oppositional to whatever, completely oppositional to whatever party holds the presidency. So this has led to what I've called federal polarization, which is a divergence in the preferences between the national government and state governments, and divergent preferences among the state governments, which I think is consistent with findings of Chris Warshaw and others, that policy choices and outcomes are increasingly varying across states in partisan ways, and an acceleration of national local conflict. I don't expect the same patterns in Korea simply because there's less, at this point, there's less local sovereignty. There is a very strong supremacy clause in the Korean constitution, which makes these conflicts less likely to lead to the sorts of paralysis that we saw in the United States COVID crisis, where the states and the national government were completely at opposite ends of the issue. Another reason why it seems less likely to be a problem in Korea is that, at least recently, with the recent presidential elections, they corresponded very well with the outcomes of regional elections, such that the Korean president now holds a very large share of mayoralties and governorships, whereas the U.S. president generally holds less. So let me just mention a couple of case studies that I conclude with that kind of draw out some of these differences. The first was a comparison of the recent impeachments in South Korea and the 3 impeachments of the last 25 years in the U.S. Again, one of the arguments I try to develop is that, there's similar levels of conflict in all of these, but the polarization in the United States combined with our institutions made it impossible to hold the president accountable in any of the three U.S. cases, whereas at least in one of the two, Korean cases, the president was convicted, was impeached by the National Assembly, and then convicted by the higher court and removed for office. So that's in part, I think, derived from the fact that there was presumably less polarization within Korea, less likely that members of the National Assembly had felt the need to kind of protect an unpopular president. But also, I argue the role of the courts in the impeachment and removal process in Korea probably depoliticizes it in a way that was helpful compared to the U.S. and its very partisan procedures. And then I conclude with kind of a discussion of the COVID crisis, really focusing on the ways in which the situation in the US was such that the COVID crisis could be politicized in a very partisan way in the United States, largely because of this federal polarization, this disjuncture between the national governments and state governments, as well as kind of an imminent presidential election, and how the Korean response, while it had some elements of partisanship and partisan conflict, was ultimately successful because those were able to be overcome. So let me just stop there, and I look forward to the question and answer session.
Great. Thank you very much, Professor McCarty. You highlighted some of the key institutional similarities and differences between the United States and Korea. And it was interesting to hear your argument on the legislative and budgetary powers of the president contributing to less lockdowns or less gridlocks, I should say, in Korea, at least so far. Now, our next speaker is Professor Kyu-Sup Han at Seoul National University, and he will provide a first look at the rise of elite polarization in Korea. So, Professor Han.
Yes, thank you. Okay, my name is Kyu Han, and I'm working on this with Sang-Bum Kim, who's a PhD candidate in the Department of Economics here at Seoul National. Okay, so I should really be doing something in the last session of this seminar because I'm usually a media politics person, but I ended up doing this. So having said that, basically in our analysis, we're trying to give a first look at the overtime change in the degree of elite polarization in South Korea. And we're not trying to provide any insights to why there is an increase or decrease in the elite polarization or mass public polarization, because especially with respect to the elite polarization, I'm not necessarily an expert on the National Assembly or anything like that, and just trying to use the data that we've collected and give you sort of something to look at in order to sort of see the status of elite polarization in South Korea. So as Professor McCarthy has mentioned, in the United States, as documented by various scholars, there's a clear evidence showing that the two parties have become increasingly polarized when gauged by roll call voting records. And what we're trying to do here is basically trying to replicate the same findings in South Korea. And also in the United States, a vast majority of researchers argue that political polarization at the mass public level has become considerably more severe since the 1970s, even though there's a debate about the nature of this mass public polarization. And some scholars even argue that polarization has advanced to a degree at which it's become part of the public's social identity. And whether mass polarization is partisan sorting or true polarization or effective polarization, elite polarization can certainly be a catalyst for the heightened degree of mass polarization, I believe. So as political elites offer highly polarized choices for the public, it reinforces mass polarization. So in order to assess the status of political polarization in South Korea, therefore, we thought that examining the elite polarization can be a useful sort of starting point. So in this analysis, we rely on three different sets of data to assess the degree of elite polarization in Korea. And first, we examined the electronic voting records or roll call voting records, the Korean equivalent of the roll call voting records, from the 17th National Assembly to the 21st National Assembly. And our data go back to 2004. So electronic voting in the National Assembly was introduced in 2004 in Korea. So as far as the roll call voting records is concerned, this is all the possible data that one could possibly use for any type of empirical analysis. And additionally, we examine bill co-sponsoring data. So here we go back to 1987, the year of democratization of South Korea, and see if between party co-sponsoring has increased or decreased over the years. And finally, we also examined the ideal points of the Supreme Court justices in Korea. And hopefully, using these data, findings will offer a meaningful sort of starting point for discovering the roots of political polarization in South Korea. And one of the difficulties we had with our analysis was it was very difficult to collect party information on the National Assembly members in Korea, because since the first National Assembly of South Korea, there was a total of 52 parties with the status of parliamentary negotiation body. And since 1987, that's what our data cover, there were 36 parties with the parliamentary negotiation body status. So just a lot of changes in party names and et cetera, and so on and so forth. So this list basically shows which parties that we considered counted as the major conservative party and the major liberal party at each point, each time point in our analysis. So here, first, when we examined all the electronic voting records between 2004 and 2021, or the first half of 2021, we fitted basically an EM item response model and estimated the ideal points of all National Assembly members from 2004 to 2021. And subsequently, we took the difference, we took the average a position of the major conservative party and the major liberal party at each time point. And this is basically what the results look like. And for clarification, for those years that there seems to be a large overlap between the two parties, such as 2004, 2012, and 2016, these were the election years in which the National Assembly elections were held. So, and it is very well known fact that toward the end of each National Assembly in South Korea, they try to process most of the bills that remain in sort of before they go out. So that overlap, or what seems to be an overlap, is just sort of an artifact of that. So if you look at this graph, basically it's clear that the two major parties' ideal points sort of fluctuate depending upon the government. So they remained relatively liberal between 2004 and 2008, which corresponds to the Roe administration, and they turned conservative between 2008 and 2017, which corresponds to the Lee Myung-bak administration, and they turned again liberal between since 2018, which of course corresponds to the beginning of the current government. So the conservative party's position remained more or less stable since about 2016 or so, whereas that of the Liberal Party continued to drop for the last 4 or 5 years. If you take the absolute difference between the average position of the two major parties in South Korea, this is basically what it looks like. When measured by the difference between the two major parties' ideal points estimates here, overall there aren't any clear signs of increasing or decreasing polarization if you look at the entire time period. So on the other hand, it's very clear that in the most recent years, the degree of polarization between the two parties has been steadily increasing since around 2016 or so, and reaching the historical high in 2021 since the introduction of the electronic voting in 2004. So this is highly suggestive of increased elite polarization, especially if you look at the last, 5, 6 years or so. And one interesting pattern is that the overall elite polarization seems to be higher during the liberal governments than the conservative governments. This could be indicative of the fact that the two liberal governments pushed forward the more progressive and reform-oriented bills, but due to the fact that our data only go back to 2004, whereas in the United States, they were talking, Professor McCarthy was talking about a trend over the 40 years. We couldn't possibly be 100% certain of what this actually means. And overall, also there's a possible cycle here in the degree of elite polarization. Two parties usually start off highly polarized in the beginning of each government. For example, if you look at the 2008 and 2013, that seems to be the case, but they seem to converge somewhat toward the end of the president's term. On the other hand, the current government seems to be an exception in the sense that the severity of polarization seems to be increasing every year, reaching the historical high in 2021, even though we have the presidential election coming up next year. But I don't want to obviously speculate too much on this matter because our data only go back for 17 years and encompassing essentially four governments. And this will be obviously a future a topic for future research, maybe down the road in 20 years. It'll be a more interesting study to do. In short, basically, when measured with the ideal point estimates of National Assembly members, the severity of elite polarization doesn't seem to have steadily increased since 2004, but nevertheless, in the most recent years, it's increased substantially since the beginning of the current administration, and we are experiencing the severity of elite polarization that's higher than ever before. And second, here we examined the proportion of cross-party bill co-sponsoring with all parties. So here, basically, our results show that co-sponsoring without party members has steadily decreased since 1987. So most specifically, this trend has become particularly pronounced around 2008 or so. For example, between 1987 and 2007, the average proportion of cross-party co-sponsoring was 46.3% for the Conservative Party and 54.6% for the Liberal Party. In other words, just about half of all co-sponsoring was with members of our party members. In sharp contrast, by 2021, it was down to 20.1% for the Conservative Party and 15.6% for the Liberal Party. So this is highly consistent with our earlier findings based on the local voting records. And based on this measure of elite polarization, we're seems to be experiencing the severity of polarization that's much higher than it was before. And here, the picture becomes even more apparent when examining the proportion of cross-party bill co-sponsoring between the two major parties. So what I just previously showed was the analysis based on the co-sponsoring with all out party members. So some of that includes actually co-sponsoring with the parties that are ideologically similar. So here we're just considering the two major parties, to two opposition parties. So to begin, pretty much the same picture emerges here. The proportion, the trend, the cross-party bill co-sponsoring has steadily decreased since 1987. And more specifically, this trend has become very pronounced since the 2008. Between 1987 and 2007, the average proportion of between party co-sponsoring was approximately 36.3% for the Conservative Party and 46.3% for the Liberal Party. On the other hand, since 2008 or so, co-sponsoring with members of the other party has steadily decreased, reaching the historical low in 2021, with 9.5% for the Conservative Party and 5.5% for the Liberal Party. So this is the lowest level of inter-party co-sponsoring between the two parties, and seems to be highly consistent with the findings based on local voting records. And I think it's worth also just briefly mention that the proportion of within-party bill co-sponsoring has obviously steadily increased since 1987, from 57.5% and 52.5% to 83.9% and 94.5%. So this is the historical high for the Liberal Party and close to the historical high for the Conservative Party as well, with the except for the 2012, 2014, and 2019. And if you look at the ideal points of Supreme Court justices in South Korea between 2006 and 2020, overall, if you look at the ideal points of Supreme Court justices by the presidents who appointed them, on average, the Moon administration appointed the most liberal Supreme Court justices on average. For comparison, for example, the Roe administration appointed some of the most liberal Supreme Court justices, but it also appointed some of the most conservative Supreme Court justices as well, making the variance very large. And on the other hand, the Park administration appointed the most conservative Supreme Court justices on average. So in short, basically the most recent two governments appointed the most ideologically extreme Supreme Court justices. And this is very telling of the elite polarization in South Korea. If you look at the sort of over time changes in the ideal points of Supreme Court justices over time, seems as if that the Supreme Court has turned somewhat liberal over the years from 2006 to 2020. And this is not surprising because on many of the social issues, obviously the Korean society has turned very liberal, and it's not surprising to see the Supreme Court therefore turning in that direction as well. And we also assessed the severity of polarization among the Supreme Court justices. Here, we first took the difference between the most liberal and the most conservative Supreme Court justices every year. And there's no clear signs of increasing or decreasing polarization over time, if you look at the entire time period. Nevertheless, in the most recent years, since 2018, the severity of polarization seems to have increased. So this is a sensible as I mentioned earlier, as the two most recent governments have appointed the most conservative and the most liberal Supreme Court justices. And here we also examined the difference between the Supreme Court justices appointed by the liberal governments and the conservative governments at each time point. And here also pretty much the same finding emerges. So in conclusion, overall, if you consider all of the data that we examined, there's some evidence showing that the severity of elite polarization seems to be increasing especially since 2008 or so, where the strongest evidence is coming from the data on bill co-sponsoring. And even with the evidence based on roll call voting records, it's clear that elite polarization has particularly been bad in recent years, reaching the historical high in 2021. And also the ideal points of Supreme Court justices, it's clear, at least during the current government, elite polarization seems to be on the rise since 2018. Thank you.
I think it gives a good first look at the trends in elite polarization in Korea. One thing I'll add to the last part of the presentation is that, as most of you know, in Korea, the Supreme Court justices do not have a lifetime appointment. They have a 6-year term, renewable. But importantly, there's a hard binding retirement age at 70. So you don't have, like in the United States, lifetime appointment. And in some cases, you have some people pushing, say, 80 plus Supreme Court justices to maybe step aside for partisan or public good. You don't have that in Korea. But even given that difference, it was interesting to see some evidence for polarization among Supreme Court justices in Korea. So, I think we can discuss a number of issues, but if I were to categorize, there may be some questions and comments on measurement. There also may be some issues having to do with institutional similarities and differences between the two countries and their possible impact on polarization. And finally, what this all means in terms of outcome, democracy and so on. So, but without restricting the range of discussions, I'd like to invite participants to raise your hand freely and to make comments or questions on the two presentations. I'll also invite the audience, the general audience, to submit their questions through the chat function of this Zoom seminar. Are there any questions? Yes, Chris?
Well, I really enjoyed both those presentations, and the estimates of polarization in the Supreme Court and the South Korean Congress were fascinating. I'm curious for both of you, what you think the differences, one of the differences you sort of both alluded to but didn't dive into in depth, is that the party system in South Korea is very different than in the United States. Where we have in the United States, we have these two very stable liberal and conservative parties. And in South Korea, the party system has been much more in flux, where parties sort of regularly appear and then merge together and split off. And what do you think what are the implications of that for how we should conceptualize sort of the nature of polarization? And then what might be, can you speculate on what is sort of the causal effect of this kind of these differences in the party systems on the challenges from polarization?
That's a great question. Let me collect a couple more questions and then ask Professor McCarty and Professor Han to respond. Are there any additional questions on the institutional aspects of the two political systems in the two countries? One thing I would like to ask both of you is, the importance of policy difference on polarization. Professor McCarthy even mentioned that in Korea, polarization seems to depend more on regional, identity differences rather than policy preference differences. And Professor Han mentioned that there's this practice of passing a backlog of bills in the last year of each National Assembly session, implying that policy differences may not be that great among parties. And I just wonder, if regional and identity differences are driving most of the polarization in Korea, does that mean that there's a lot more room for compromise, or is it something like a winner-take-all system, and where you belong is actually much more important than what you believe in, and lack of differences on, or weak differences in policy preferences may not have much bearing on polarization. So that's something I think about quite a bit these days. Okay, are there any other questions? Okay, then let me first turn to Professor McCarthy for your thoughts on Chris's question and my question.
Sure. So obviously, I'm not an expert on the Korean party system, and we've been blessed in the United States by at least having two parties that have kept the same names for over 180 years. So it makes it it makes it easy. But one of the things I was struck by in the presentation was that despite the fact that there were all these new parties, name changes, splintering, that there was some continuity in the measures of the right party and the left party, which suggests that really a lot of what's going on in Korea is just renaming and marketing, not kind of fundamental reorientations of those parties to, from one election to another. So I can't say that with any specificity. Although when I was, doing my background reading on Korea, it's very identifiable that the same people would be involved in a sequence of parties, and it was really the names that were changing, and not the people. On the actual policy differences, that's a very interesting question. Methodologically, it's hard to get out purely from the roll call analysis. So what we've done in the U.S., because we've been doing it for so long, is we do secondary analyses using the roll calls to see the extent to which they actually map onto policy positions and map onto substantive policy differences, to ensure that it's really policy differences and not something else. And so I think a next stage for doing this type of work in South Korea would be to kind of do that. One obvious thing to check, especially on the co-sponsorship analysis, is to see whether or not they're co-sponsoring the same types of bills or different types of bills. One can imagine a situation where the policy preferences are the same and each party is proposing its version of the same bill, but they're not cooperating with one another because of the regional or affective differences. And so, as opposed to a situation where the parties are proposing very different types of bills. So that'd be interesting to unpack. There was a question in the chat, which I think is relevant here as well, which is like, how do we know that these are ideological differences that are being picked up and not other things? So, I mean, I can let let the author speak to that. But one of the things that's important to note about roll call analysis is that you get a lot of leverage by doing it over time and dynamically, where you estimate an ideal point for a member over a long career, so that you're observing that member both when he's in the President's Party, when he's out of the President's Party, when he's in the Assembly majority, when he's out of the Assembly majority, when she's, up for election and not up for election, so that by getting this kind of long-term effect that's not impacted by these fluctuations in their status, you can say it's something like ideology rather than kind of institutional position or status. So the question in the chat makes reference to a study based on a single National Assembly. If you're looking at a single National Assembly, you don't have that leverage to kind of parse out, those changes over time.
But in that case, do you sort of assume stability of ideological policy preference?
So in the U.S., we typically assume that, but there've been a lot of work kind of checking the validity of that assumption. It used to be very strongly valid up to the point. I think Adam has called into question just how stable, but I think it's not willy-nilly unstable, so that you can still, if you model the movement, you can still learn things by purging out things like majority status, minority status, and maybe even pick up those effects by through the modeling. So again, just my basic point here is that you learn a lot from doing this over time, comparing the same members in different situations than you do by looking at a single National Assembly.
Okay. Professor Han, your comments on the questions?
Yes, I guess I was hoping that other political scientists would actually jump in for a discussion like this, because I was trying to avoid any kind of questions on the institutional characteristics of the Korean National Assembly. But my sort of thoughts on the two questions, based on my experience with the data, is that as to the first question that Chris asked, essentially I think Professor McCarthy is correct. The name changes of these parties is pretty much, a lot of it is basically a marketing strategy. Whenever their approval ratings go down, they change their name and they pretend as if that they formed a completely new party. But if you actually look at the members of the party, it's pretty much the same party. So it's essentially we do have a multi-party system, but essentially it's very close to the American party system, where usually there are two major parties, one conservative and one liberal party, and that's been the case at least since 1987. Okay. And there is a slight change in the nature of the two parties. For example, the regional ties of the two parties have become somewhat weaker when compared to maybe 20 years ago. But aside from that, I think essentially it's mostly what you're referring to, some name changes, and that makes our analysis more difficult. But in terms of sort of substantive differences, I think it means a lot more than a name change. And as to the second question that Professor Lim asked, and also with respect to the question that was in the chat, I do think that what we're capturing with these local data is somewhat of a combination of both the ideological sort of leanings of these National Assembly members, plus as some the person asked in the chat window, essentially a lot of it is also about whether how much you support the incumbent president, and how much you're opposed to the incumbent president, and so on and so forth. So I think it's a combination of both of them. And I think over time, it's sort of which of those two factors influence more the ideal points that we're capturing here. I think it sort of fluctuates over time. So for example, if you look at the position, average position, I think the person who asked the question mentioned the Justice Party, and which is the Labor Party in Korea. And if you look at their position, we haven't done a systematic analysis on this, so I'm just sort of, saying from my experience when the data that I've seen in the past. So maybe 10 years ago, we did a similar analysis. We first did this analysis 10 years ago or 11 years ago. The Justice Party seemed to be on the left, clearly sort of distinguishable from the Democratic Party or the major liberal party. But in recent years, my recollection is that the position of the two parties seem to be more mixed than they were before. And I'm not sure exactly what that means, but that seems to be an indication that some of the things that we're capturing with the local voting records as the ideal points is, as the person who asked the question mentioned in the, it is about the incumbent president and the opposition party. So it is true that some of that is captured in the ideal points of the estimates. And also, as to the question Professor Lim asked, I do believe that it is true that the policy difference or the actual difference in their ideology is probably much smaller than their voting, what their voting records would indicate. For example, if you look at the, we did, one of my students wrote a master's thesis on this, so sort of top of my head right now. So what she did was she looked at the, what these National Assembly members had said during the campaign. And also they looked at the survey results that of these National Assembly members and compared them with their roll call ideal point estimates. And many of these National Assembly members seem to be more moderate during the campaign. And also in the surveys, their self-reported ideology seems to be much more moderate than their ideal point estimates. So it is true, I think, to a certain extent, like Professor Lim said, there's a difference between their true ideology and their actual voting tendency.
Okay, thanks for that insight. Let me now move to the second round of questions and comments. Are there any questions or comments you have for the presentations? Yes, Jim Brisbane.
Thanks. Yeah, so I put this in the chat, but I think any of us who try and estimate ideology with a measure like the one you described or the others that we're familiar with from the United States, even in the best case scenario, we're always a little worried that it's more multidimensional than the single line assumption that we think that we're getting. And in the particular context of Korea, if it is the case that it is combining actual ideology traditionally understood with, call it presidential support or fealty or something, I was hoping you could just comment on what this means. Is it still a useful metric for us if we're interested in polarization, elite level polarization, because we are worried about the ability for deliberative democracy to resolve conflict, you know, sort of the main motivating reasons why we're interested in polarization writ large, just to like throw a totally off right off the brain pan idea here, if it is the case that both parties are really following the president, that suggests a fair amount of coordination, collaboration. It's sort of not the types of things that we worry about when we're worried about elite polarization. But perhaps I'm wrong. I'm just trying to think of if these types of measures, even though they are more multidimensional than we would like, if they're still useful.
Any other questions? Could you respond to that question, Professor Han?
Well, I think if our objective is to represent the will of the voters in the National Assembly, I think, and avoid this elite level polarization to sort of reinforce the mass public polarization and partisan sorting among the public. I think in that sense, I think examining this, the ideal points of National Assembly members would be useful. I think maybe theoretically, whether we're actually capturing the policy differences between the two parties or not, and how much of it is actually contaminated by other things like presidential support and so on and so forth. I think that would be an interesting question for the scholars, but I think for whether if our objective is to see whether still able to reach a sort of somewhat of an agreement and avoid the further reinforcing the mass public level sort of polarization. I think examining this would be an interesting result, and that would be sort of my thoughts and the reason why we have been actually continuing to do this in the past 10 years or so.
Yes, Noah?
Yeah, so on this supporting the president, in the U.S. context, Francis Lee has a very interesting book analysis that basically shows that if the president publicizes a proposal, it becomes partisan and in a very polarized way, which it wasn't before. So probably her most interesting example is George W. Bush said he wanted to send a man to the moon. So it's an issue that had never been partisan before. But suddenly sending a man to the moon became a Republican issue and something that the Democrats vehemently opposed, simply because the president had taken that. So I mean, I think you can get at the question about presidential support or non-support versus other levels of polarization by looking at the different patterns of voting on presidential initiatives and internal initiatives. They're very high profile, presidential initiatives. Then do they appear to be more polarized than the ideal points estimated on the lower salience issues would suggest or not? I mean, that could be contaminated a little bit by the fact that, legislators may know where the president stands and may be responsive or in opposition to that based on things that are less obvious to the analyst. But I think if you find, big differences across issues that the president's very public on and against those issues in which he's not, will give you some leverage for purging out at least some of the presidential approval effect.
And in Korea's case, because presidency is basically a 5-year single term, right? Lame duck sets in fairly early, and I'm not sure whether you can rely on continued support or opposition to the president as a driving force for sustained period in Korea, because single term dynamics. And I don't know whether in the United States, whether that kind of phenomenon is different depending on where the president is in his term, first or second term. So that's something to think about if it's just driven by, a partisan behavior, a party discipline, if you will, in sense of supporting the president or not. So it's kind of something to think about. Yes, did you raise your hand, Chris? Or no? Okay, no. Okay. Are there any other comments? If not, I'd like to ask a question about the point Professor McCarty made about the decentralization, because I mean, if you look at unemployment insurance supplement payment, right? The source of funding comes from the federal government, so it's not local government, state government's own money, but at the same time, you have Republican-led states refusing to, go ahead with the supplement. You would probably not find that in Korea. Part of the reason, I think, is that financial autonomy of local governments is much lower than in the United States. But also, I think ideological or policy differences on that front are not that big in Korea, it seems. It just appears to me. So on local level, decentralization, central versus local government angle, how does political polarization affect policy choices and central government's behavior, if you will? I don't know whether you have any further ideas on that topic, Professor McCarty.
Yeah. So I'm sure you're right about in South Korea that perhaps the partisan differences aren't so great. I mean, here's the thing about the unemployment, supplemental unemployment. You're right; it comes from the federal government. The states have no skin in the game, but there's a belief, whether it's true or ideologically driven among Republicans, is that these unemployment benefits are reducing the labor supply of low-income workers, and so this is just a policy position designed to support small business owners and restaurateurs and stuff like that. So it's not a fiscal matter at all. It's just part of the ideological discourse has become that over-generous unemployment reduces the labor supply of people willing to work in restaurants and other low-wage jobs. I think the evidence, and Chris is a real expert on the policy differences across states, but almost every policy area has polarized along state lines, whether it's environmental laws. We currently see a big push in Republican states to have restrictive abortion laws, even though abortion is technically constitutionally protected. We're seeing great differences in terms of voting laws and voting access laws, marijuana, regulation of marijuana. I mean, or the decriminalization of marijuana. So there's just a wide variety of policy issues in which the states are moving apart from each other, and then by definition, that means that some of the states are moving away from the federal government. One of the main sources of this, I believe, is what we kind of refer to as the nationalization of U.S. politics, such that it's no longer the case that all politics is local, it's all national. And so some of these differences are reflective of the fact that local level, state level politicians want to take stands on national issues because they're the ones that get the most publicity. They're the ones that donors are more likely to support. They're the ones that voters care the most about. Um, so a lot of it's just driven simply by the fact that, you know, Republican politicians want to take Republican positions on local issues like unemployment insurance, and Democratic politicians want to take positions on national issues. I mean, it's worth remembering that Barack Obama originally became famous for a speech on the Iraq War that he gave in the Illinois State Senate. So it goes back a long ways, in which a lot of like local political effort has gone into position taking, you know, on national and international political issues.
We are nearing the end of this session. Professor Han, do you have any parting thoughts on your presentation or any of the discussions we had? Okay. Okay, it's 10:20 in Korea and 9:20 in the United States. We are now wrapping up session 1, and after a 10-minute break, we'll resume with session 2 on voter polarization. So thank you very much for your presentations, Professor McCarty and Professor Han.
Okay. Thank you.
The second session will be on the voter polarization, and the moderator will be Professor Nolan McCarty from Princeton University.
Great, thank you. So welcome back for the second panel. In this panel, we will take up the issue of voter polarization as distinct from the previous panel, which focused on the polarization of partisan elites. As we know from studying the question
The second
of voter
session will be
polarization in
on
the US
the
for
voter
almost 30
polarization,
years,
and
it's
the
not quite as
moderator
straightforward
will
as we
be
would
Professor
expect it to
Nolan
be,
McCarty from
especially in
Princeton
terms of its
University.
relationship to elite polarization in the
Great,
parties.
thank you.
So also lots of very interesting questions about the nature of voter polarization, the extent to which it's based on fundamental policy and value differences across voters, the extent to which it's cleaved by parties, the extent to which it's driven by partisanship, the extent to which it itself is driven by elite polarization, and the extent to which it's may or may not be just simply manifestations of kind of social identity. So the next two papers will take up those questions and perhaps others in the context of public opinion data in Korea. So we have two papers. The first is titled Opinion Polarization in Korea, which will be presented by Professor Cheng-Kyun Lee of the KDI School. And the second paper is Partisan Polarization, the Mass Public in the South Korea and the US by Professor Chris Warshaw of George Washington University. So let me turn it over to Professor Lee to start.
Okay, thank you, Professor McCarthy. So let me share my slides. So I introduce, my name is Chang-Gun Lee. I'm at KDI School, and I'm an economist in the beginning. So I would like to get a lot of good comments about this study and potentially develop it. And here's motivation. There was a report by Pew Research Center about the US voter polarization. It observed a widening gap in values and attitudes among US voters, and it says partisanship remains biggest factor in public's political values. So this graph measures the difference between two groups defined by party identity, race, religion, education, age, and gender, and only party membership or identity that explains a widening gap among US voters. So I wondered whether Korea have such a similar gap between voters, because there was a growing concerns about divided public opinion in Korea. So here are two pictures. The left is a mass demonstration against prosecution's office and opposition party, and the right is conservative rally against ruling party and the former justice minister. So that event in the fall of 2019 was a good example of divided public opinion over important social and political issues in Korea. So my curiosity was like, whether that represents a widespread phenomenon about public opinion division. So I just wanted to test it using popular survey data and using some custom design and survey data. So I would like to present some facts I found from empirical analysis. So here are three questions I tried to answer. The first one is whether the ideological division increased over long run in Korea. Here I use the term ideological division instead of a partisan division, because as explained by previous presenters, in Korea, partisan membership is very low, and partisan identity is not very strong among Korean voters. And party system has been very unstable. but still voters have very strong, some voters have very strong ideological orientation and attachment to one of two major parties in Korea, liberal and conservative. So I used self-defined ideological orientation, and I observed how the gap between the liberal, so progressive, and conservative groups has evolved. And after making an observation about the long run evolution of political gap between voters, I turned my attention to ideological consistency because I find no supporting evidence for a widening gap in public opinion. So I focus on ideologically consistent voters because I thought that they might be overrepresented and they have greater influence on political scene. So that's why we see growing even though the elite polarization in Korea is not as great as that of America, that was growing since 2018. So probably that is affected by ideologically consistent voters and their activism. So I look at partisan animosity and political activism and partisan sorting, and I wanted to have a look at how that unfolds in the specific context of COVID-19, because there were many arguments and concerns that dealing with COVID-19 has been very seriously politicized, and policymaking process has been affected by politics rather than science. Not only in America, but also in Korea. So these three questions are main topics I would like to discuss today. So first of all, I examined the World Value Survey to observe the long run evolution of ideological distribution. So that's a self-defined ideological position, and that's on a 10-point Likert scale. And I defined those who answered between 4 and 7 as moderate, so central. So I looked at 5 different waves between 1996 and 2018. And as you can see, we can't find any sign of ideological shift. So there was no sign of leaning toward left or right. And then based on this observation, I compared different groups of ideological orientation and how different views they have on important social issues. So here I put 3 graphs that shows there are different opinions about inequality and responsibility of individuals in terms of personal economic issues and their views about competition. And as you can see, there are some differences between conservative people and liberal people, but the gaps have not been widened over time. And even after the impeachment of former president in 2017, because the 7th wave was conducted in 2018. So there was some common shift towards some conservative or progressive direction, but we don't see any sign that the gap between 2 groups has grown over time. And here another set of graphs which shows their stance toward homosexuality and gender equality and environment. Again, I find no sign of widening gap among Korean voters. And I put a picture that's similar to what was provided by a Pew Research Center. So I grouped all the respondents into 2 groups, so old and young, and female and male, and more educated and less educated, and conservative and progressive. And I looked at how the gaps between two groups have changed over time. And again, I don't see any sign of political polarization in terms of voter opinion. So my preliminary conclusion was that there is no supporting evidence for widening polarization. So because ideological gap does not explain Korea's opinion division, then perhaps some voters are overrepresented, and they have more disproportional power on policy making and politics. And existing work has observed that more politically oriented voters have more firm beliefs and greater influence. For example, one study by a Korean scholar, Yong-Suk Lee at Stanford, it showed that even after the ruling of Constitutional Court, uh, voters with strong attachment to their conservative belief, they didn't change their um, thoughts about some myth and some fake news about former president behaviors and others. And the same, it was the same for very voters with very strong progressive ideas. So I thought ideological consistency could capture this kind of attachment to certain ideology or party identity. So I conducted my own survey thanks to our KDI School generous funding. And I tried to measure how individuals' view on socioeconomic issues are aligned with typical partisan values, following the methods adopted by many scholars and polling institutes. So I selected 10 questions, and I asked the respondents to answer on a 0 to 10 Likert scale. And these questions are the ones that divide progressive and conservative. So Democratic Party and People's Power, which is conservative, main conservative party in Korea. And so, for example, the use of military power and their stance toward peace and North Korea. So Democratic Party usually advocates more peace and good relationship with North Korea. So I label 0 to 3 as progressive, so liberal or pro-Democratic Party, and 7 to 10 is conservative and pro-conservative party. I do the same for other questions like foreign policy and social welfare and big business policy and their attitude toward inherited wealth and tax burden, family value, and sexual minority and gender equality. And then I assigned 1 to conservative, 0 to moderate, and -1 to progressive responses. And I added up. So the summed up value ranges between -10 and 10. And with this number, with this consistency index, all the respondents are categorized into 5 groups. So consistently conservative, mostly conservative, mixed, mostly progressive, and consistently progressive. And here are some graphs that shows the distribution of ideological consistency. And one thing we should bear in mind is that the survey was conducted in February this year. And until that time, the Conservative Party has had a relatively low rating, and the sample somehow represented liberals or progressive a little bit more than conservatives. So while about 5.7% of all respondents are defined to be consistently conservative. Only 1.5% of respondents are defined to be consistently progressive, because the progressive or pro-democratic party captures much of the central ground. But still, a vast majority of voters are mixed, and they have mixed views, because about 55.6% of all voters have very mixed views about important socioeconomic issues. But among progressive and conservative, the share of ideologically consistent voters go up to 4.5% and 19.2%. And about 2% of Democratic Party supporters are consistently progressive, but in contrast, 23% of 7% of People's Power supporters are consistently conservative. And I asked how they feel about Democratic Party, People's Power, and the current president, former president, Japan, China, and Christianity. And I included other demographic characteristics on the right-hand side of the regression tables, but I just simply didn't report in this table. And all these four variables are dummy variable. So the table shows that consistent voters have very strong negative feelings about the other party and the other party's leader. So as you can see, consistently conservative voters have a very negative view about Democratic Party and the current president, and consistently progressive voters have very negative view about Conservative Party and former president. But I also found the antipathy is much stronger among conservatives. And one of the interesting facts is that such ideological gap also appears in kind of diplomacy and attitudes about other countries, because conservative voters have very positive feeling about Japan, while it has very negative views about China. And Christianity is another dimension that draws line between conservative and progressive, also in Korea. And as you can see, progressive voters, consistently progressive voters have very negative view about Christianity, while consistently conservative voters have very positive feelings about Christianity. So I find very strong kind of emotional division among ideologically consistent voters. And here I find that consistent voters tend to mingle together, because they find it hard to make friends with politically different people. And it's very difficult to get married with people with very different political views. And they meet friends who share similar political views. And this is the case for a conservative only, but they depend on social network service and YouTube to gain information about important policy issues. And they contrast a lot in their opinion about the trustworthiness of 2020 general election. And consistently conservative voters don't like their parties to compromise. They prefer their parties maintain their position and going strong. So I thought this could be a sign that ideologically consistent voters, so voters with very strong political orientation, they have very different attitudes. And if they have a greater political voice, and that could lead to a very strong confrontation in National Assembly. So, and another thing I found from this table was that, again, conservatives rely more on social media as information source, and they have very strong stance in terms of political compromise and political deliberation. But another interesting factor was that political sorting, I mean, not in a geographical sense, but more kind of in terms of relationship, sorting was much stronger among progressive. And I looked at their political behavior and activism, and consistent voters had greater voices because they participate more in political activities. Like consistent progressive voters, they talk a lot about politics, and they participated in political rallies in the last 3 years. And they were more likely to have participated in petitions to Blue House. And that was also the case for consistent conservative voters. And they voted all elections the last 3 years. And you can see a clear difference between mild progressive and consistent progressive, and mild conservative and consistently conservative voters. So these two groups, even though they account for relatively small portion of all voters, they are more active and they participate more, and they have very strong attachment to their own party, and they have strong antipathy against other parties. And I looked at how that turns into their attitude toward COVID-19 and COVID-19 quarantine policy. So I asked these 8 questions, and I ran similar regressions to see how ideological consistency is associated. I can't say that this is kind of causation or causality, but this is more like a statistical association. But in this, I can show you that ideologically consistent voters have very different attitude and strong attitude toward COVID-19 policy. For example, one of the controversial topics was whether the current government is to blame because they didn't ban the entry from China. And as you can see, there's strong division between progressive and conservative. And consistently conservative voters strongly believe that much of the COVID-19 crisis in Korea is due to the policy mistake by Korean government. And because many news reports say that the big political demonstration, which was led by a big religious group in August last year, that led to the second wave in Korea. I also asked how they think about the responsibility of religion for COVID-19 spread. And consistently conservative voters didn't like the idea, and they didn't think that big churches are not responsible for COVID-19. And to me, these were very interesting because usually conservative voters have belief and they have pro-business stance, and they prefer less regulation and commitment of government to market discipline. And Korea introduced public mask system in the early days of COVID-19 because there was a shortage of masks, and the government controlled the price and quantity of masks to guarantee that each one of Korean people could get a mask, and to provide some incentives to mask producing firms. The government committed to some guaranteed price, which was 1,500 won per unit. And that was about the credibility of the government in the market economy. but conservative voters thought that guaranteeing mask price was bad, even though that was necessary to induce the firms to produce as many masks as possible. And even though many small businesses complained that the quarantine policy is too rigid and too strong, and they prefer flexible social distancing policy, and usually conservative party and conservative voters were more pro self-employed people. They had different views about the policy preference about social distancing, and they didn't like flexible social distancing policy, and it was more preferred by mild progressive people. And they didn't like the idea of compensating the self-employed small businesses because the government banned or restricted the opening hours or something. But the thing was that social distance, flexible social distancing policy and compensation for the self-employed people, these were all proposed by the government and the ruling parties. So the thing is that the conservative voters and consistently conservative voters in particular, they didn't like any policy that is proposed and implemented by the government. So in some sense, we can say that they show some objection to any kind of government policy. And this specific context and example shows how a small group of voters with strong belief and political orientation, but with a greater political influence, can affect overall policy preference and policy making. So this is what I prepared for today's presentation. So to summarize, I found little evidence of opinion polarization, and ideologically consistent voters, they tend to have strong political views and mingle with the same ideology. So that reinforces this kind of division between people with strong political orientation. But because they're more politically active and make greater voices, they are more likely to have political influence. And this case study about COVID-19 indicates some sign of politicization of a pandemic, which is very, which should be addressed with science rather than politics. But unfortunately, even in Korea, COVID-19 and its policy has been politicized. So this is all I have today. And yep.
Perfect. Thank you. Okay, so now we'll turn it over to Chris Warshaw, who will kind of do some more explicit comparisons of the U.S. And South Korea.
Great. Well, I'm excited to be here today. I'm excited to talk to all of you. So I think this is a great sequence of presentations. So my presentation is going to build on, oops. Can you see my shared screen?
Yeah, but you're not in full screen.
Did that and it killed it. Can you still see it now? Got it. Okay, why don't I just do this?
Yep.
Now you got it?
Good. Yep.
All right,
got
super. So I'm going to build on the presentations that we just saw, and I'm going to focus more directly. So I think Professor Lee's presentation focused on polarization between self-described liberals and conservatives. And one of the conclusions was that there isn't a lot of policy polarization between self-described liberals and conservatives. So I'm going to look at the flip side of it and look at partisan polarization. And I think my view and the view of much of the American politics literature, which is where much of my work focuses, is that partisan polarization is pretty politically important. And that's for a couple reasons that Nolan built on in the earlier presentation. So one is that the relationship between elite polarization and mass polarization, I think, is complicated, but surely the polarization among the mass public helps accelerate and drive polarization among elites. And moreover, I think that the more polarization proceeds in the mass public, it essentially means that people are only voting based on ideological or partisan lines, which makes accountability really difficult. I think that's one thing we saw in recent US elections, is that if people are only voting based on parties, then it really reduces the incentives for politicians to solve big problems like the COVID-19 crisis, to grow the economy, and to try to head off scandals. And then finally, I think there's a growing body of evidence that polarization in the mass public really weakens democratic stability, because it means that people will do all kinds of things that to sort of support their party, rather than trying to support the underlying institutional fabric of the country. So in this presentation, I'm going to look at how polarized are partisans in South Korea and the United States. So we'll look first at trends in polarization on individual issues, and then I'll look at trends in ideological polarization. And I think to give you a preview of my punchline, I think that my results really mirror the earlier ones, that I don't see a lot of evidence of partisan polarization in South Korea, and certainly nothing like what we see in the United States. So to just sort of give you a lay of the land of what this looks like in the United States. So my research in the United States is really, much of it is focused on the public opinion at the mass level, and trying to estimate how divided are people in different states and in different parties, both within states and across the country. And if you look at this graph, shows you the difference between Democrats and Republicans on individual policy issues. Things like, do you support a certain minimum wage? Do you support same-sex marriage? Do you support abortion rights? Do you support, gun control, or maybe restricting people gun control? And on these individual issues, the gap between Democrats and Republicans has grown from almost nothing on many issues, particularly on sort of cultural and racial issues. There was very little difference between Democrats and Republicans in the mass public in the 1950s and 60s. And then today, there's a difference on any individual policy issue of between 30 and 40% between Democrats and Republicans. That implies that, like in the minimum wage, maybe 70% of Democrats would support the minimum wage and only 30% of Republicans. So these are quite large gaps on individual issues. And when you aggregate that up to look at the ideological preferences in the mass public, you see very similar patterns. So on racial and social issues, there grew from being no difference between Democrats and Republicans in the 1960s to these enormous differences today. On economic issues, there's always been a gap between Democrats and Republicans, at least as far back as our data goes to the 1940s. But that's also grown today. So that this graph is in standardized terms. So it's saying that there's roughly 4 standard deviation difference between the average of Democrats and Republicans, which is obviously an enormous difference. We can see the similar patterns both not just at the national level, but within individual states. So this graph shows you some patterns among Democrats and Republicans in Georgia and New York. So in the 1960s, I think Nolan was alluding to this in his presentation, the real cleavages were sort of geographic. So here you can see that in Georgia on say racial issues, both Democrats and Republicans were very conservative and really racist in their views in the 1950s and 60s. And there was really no difference between the parties. And over time, the Democrats have really rapidly liberalized, and Republicans have liberalized a little bit. And today, parties in different states are actually very similar to each other. The Republicans in New York and Georgia look almost identical, which is very different than it was 50 years ago. And this really is a reflection of the nationalization of American politics. So what I want to do here is to compare these trends in South Korea to how they look in the United States. So the caveat is that in the United States, we have this access to this enormous corpus of data. So the graphs that I just showed you were built on millions of survey responses to hundreds, if not thousands, of policy questions. Whereas when we try to compare the United States and South Korea, we really need a set of surveys that has similar questions for both countries. And really the World Values Survey is the main survey that we have access to that includes questions for both the US and South Korea. Now, this table gives you a flavor of some of the issues that I looked at. So I looked at, and the earlier presentation talked about some of these as well. So I looked at cultural issues like abortion, euthanasia, divorce, economic issues like, should we have private ownership of business? And then also issues related to sexism and women's rights. Now, as I'll talk about in a second, there's a lot of, it's methodologically, it's not always obvious. Should we collapse these different substantive domains to estimate a one-dimensional model, or should we keep them separate? Now, in the United States, I'll jump back in a second, but in the United States, what we've seen is that in the mid-20th century, really economic and social issues were almost uncorrelated with each other. The correlation across state parties was close to zero in the 1950s and 60s. And we saw that in the graph I showed you earlier, whereas the Democrats in Georgia, both the Democrats and Republicans in Georgia were like way to the right of either Democrats or Republicans in northern states on many issues. Whereas today, the correlation across issues is, quite getting close to 100%. There's really like no difference in whether you're a liberal on an economic issue or a cultural issue today in the United States. So methodologically, what this implies is that the dimensionality of public opinion is collapsing to being somewhat high dimensional to being really quite one dimensional in the United States. But when I'm looking at trying to compare South Korea and the United States, I didn't want to assume anything about the dimensionality. So I kept the domain substantively separate in all of the analyses that are going to follow. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk you through both some individual issues on these different substantive domains, as well as scales of the mass public's ideological preferences using an IRT model, which is very similar to some of the graphs that we saw earlier, both of polarization in the United States Congress, as well as the South Korean Congress. And then finally, I'll do some work with symbolic ideology, whether people essentially say they're liberal or conservative. And I'll note that it's really difficult to interpret what people mean when they say they're a liberal or conservative. I think what I found in a paper looking at public opinion in Europe was that it's not always the same both across groups or across countries what people mean when they say they're a liberal or conservative. And it's challenging to sort of substantively interpret that. So I'll leave that for last. And then two other things I want to briefly note, which are similar to the earlier presentations. The party system in the US is very stable. In South Korea, it's been in flux. So I did some work to try to collapse the South Korean parties, but I didn't collapse them quite as much as some of the earlier presentation, just because I sort of felt a little bit less confident in my like substantive ability to standardize them entirely. But I did collapse sort of the obvious ones where it was just like a name change. So on economic issues, I'll start there. And there's two patterns I want to highlight, and you'll see this both on the individual issues, like on unemployment, taxing the rich, and whether income should be more equal. Another thing, by the way, I'll say is the World Values Survey, while it's great that it's comparable across countries, the individual survey items aren't perfect. So I'll just leave that as another sort of caveat. But what you'll see is that across the board, the United States is more conservative. So higher values here mean conservative. So across the board, the United States is more conservative in economic issues than the South Korean public. And I think that's an important thing just to sort of put on the table before one even gets to polarization. And it's going to actually look totally different in other issue domains. But on this issue domain, the United States is more conservative than South Korea. But there's these enormous gaps between the parties, which are getting at least somewhat larger over time. Whereas in South Korea over here, we really see only modest differences between the parties and almost no growth over time. And earlier in the time period, there was like no difference whatsoever between the parties. Now, if you squint really hard, you can see some differences. but they're still modest compared to the United States. And we see, the patterns look very different if you aggregate up the individual issues to produce an ideological scale. So on cultural issues, though, it looks like at least the aggregate patterns actually look pretty different. So in social issues, the United States is generally more liberal than South Korea. So in things like abortion and homosexuality, things like that, the United States, even the Republicans in the United States look sort of more liberal than the parties do in South Korea. But once again, we see no change in polarization over time in South Korea, unlike in the United States, where there's a marked increase in polarization over the last decade. And we see the same thing again on the ideological scales, which sort of summarize the issues. And I wanted to present it this way because I think it's, going back to some of the earlier questions about what are these scales really capturing? It's helpful here to where we can, on the public opinion data, it's really straightforward to build up the modeled scales based on the individual policy issues. And you can really see that they're like faithfully representing the patterns we see in the raw data. So then finally on women's rights too, we see that the United States is well to the left of South Korea. Both the Democrats and Republicans are to the left of what South Korean public says. But again, you see the much larger polarization in the United States, although maybe here we see a hint of polarization emerging in South Korea, but it's still more modest than in the United States. So my large takeaway from looking at the body of issue data is that polarization, we see confirm the fact that polarization in the United States is large and increasing, where we have pretty modest polarization in South Korea. The last thing I'll take you through is the symbolic ideology scale that Professor Lee's presentation focused on. So this is whether people self-identify as a liberal or conservative. And here again, you can see in the United States, we have, in the bottom right graph, you've got large and growing gaps between Democrats and Republicans. But in South Korea, the top graph is based on the, I think it's the General Social Survey from South Korea. I'm not 100% sure, but it's a larger time series. And on this graph, you don't really see much increase in polarization. When we look at the World Values Survey, on the other hand, we actually do see a little bit of an increase in polarization here. And it's not obvious to me what to make of the different surveys. I think my view is in general, the more data, the better. And the sample sizes in the World Values Survey are pretty small. So it could be an aberration, but I think we're starting to see maybe a little bit of a hint of larger polarization here in South Korea. And again, going back to my earlier point, it's not obvious what to make of these changes in symbolic ideology. If people are a little more likely to say they're a liberal now in the Justice Party or the People's Party, I don't know. But it does suggest maybe a hint of polarization in South Korea there. But overall, to summarize, the mass public's partisan polarization in the United States has really increased across the board. That's particularly so when you look over the long scale of the past 50 years, but it's also true over the last decade or two. In South Korea, there's both much smaller differences between the parties and very small changes over time, with the possible exception of a little bit of evidence of polarization on symbolic ideology. And in my view, the lack of partisan polarization in South Korea has largely positive implications for elections, political accountability, and democratic stability. So I'll stop there and I look forward to questions. Thank you.
Terrific. Two really, really excellent papers and presentations. So actually, my first question, I want to start off on this question of ideological self-definition or symbolic ideology. I think this is a very important issue for kind of doing comparative work on public opinion. And so first a question: is it true in the World Value Study that the questions are translated into Korean as liberal, conservative, or moderate? And the question of how would a normal Korean voter, interpret those labels? I mean, in European politics, liberal is often taken to mean kind of free market, conservative on what American would call conservative on economic policy. and conservative is typically a traditionalist. So it's less obvious that in the Korean context that they would be interpretable in the same way that we would interpret them in the U.S., which is different than the way they would be interpreted in Europe. So any thoughts on any thoughts on that question would be helpful. Second thing I thought on Professor Lee's paper, I think it actually does show a fair amount of kind of ideological structure in the Korean electorate. It's just not showing up as kind of partisan differences per se. And so I think you rightly look at consistency. But I think there's another difference between what you're finding and what Professor Warshall's finding, which is that we often sort of take polarization as a difference in kind of means, and we kind of forget that what's driving a lot of it is kind of the tails of these distributions. So almost by definition, when you look at these consistently progressive and consistently conservative voters, you're talking about relatively small groups on the extremes. And so perhaps in terms of the presentation discussion, you might want to quantify the numbers of those, and I don't know, maybe use some of the world value studies in the same way to kind of do consistency, to kind of see whether those tails have gotten larger over time. In the US, for whatever reason, we sort of gave up on looking to see whether the tails were getting farther out and really focused on the partisan differences. But that doesn't mean this can be true in every country. So do either of you want to respond to either of those? If you can, it'd be great if you can. If not, we can turn to other questions. Yeah, Chris?
I don't know about the language of the GSS, but I can just share one quick point to build on this point about the relationship between symbolic ideology and policy ideology. So this is a paper I did on Europe, and where we estimated the sort of policy preferences of people in every European country, and we can compare that to whether they say they're liberal or conservative. And essentially what we found is that the correlation is weak and varies across countries between these ideological placements and whether people say they're liberal or conservative. So on economic issues, it was 0.35, but on a different economic measure, it was essentially, the correlation is essentially 0. And on immigration issues, the correlation's 0.25. So there's just very weak correlations between policy preferences and whether people say they're liberal or conservative when you compare across countries, especially. So I think this is the kind of thing that I think it's just really hard to know what to make of, especially when you're comparing countries. And I think it'd be great for future research to unpack this more in South Korea, what people really mean when they're using these terms.
Yeah. If I could just add to that, it's not just comparing across countries, it's even comparing within the United States over time. One of the things that's been true about US polarization is that the definitions of conservative and liberal have been imprinted on voters' brains in a way that they weren't before. I mean, there were many times in surveys in the 1950s and 60s, conservative voters were taking positions that were considerably more left-wing than the liberal voters. But that has really switched in the US over time, in large part because liberal and conservative become important political identities, in and of themselves. So, okay, so let me open up to other questions from the participants, if there are any.
So if I can answer Nolan's question about what liberal and conservative means in Korea, so I might be wrong, but my understanding is that there has been stable opinion, on North Korea and economic policy, depending on whether you are liberal and a conservative. I think, Koreans adopt a similar kind of definition what liberals and conservative means. But on social issues, I think there might be some changes on, in terms of, women's rights and things like it. So I don't think that there's a clear distinction between liberals and conservative on social issues, but in terms of economic policies and their attitude toward North Korea, I think the attitude has been pretty stable. So if you're estimating, opinion on those dimensions, I think you can interpret that as a kind of similar to U.S., but on social issues like gay marriage or women's issue, that we might need a more local context. But I might be wrong because I don't study Korean politics. So if you are more familiar with the Korean politics, feel free to correct me.
Okay. We have a couple of questions here. They're both in the chat. They're both for Professor Lee. The first asked really about the extent of affective polarization in Korea, which is just simply the emotional dislike of one party's members versus another party's members. So what do we know? What do we know about that in Korea? Is it? I mean, you found some of it in your kind of consistent conservative, consistent progressives, not about partisans, but about the other side. But what do we know about what we call affective polarization in Korea?
I think I had another question. So would it be possible to answer in reverse order?
Sure. So you want to answer the Christianity question?
Right.
Okay, let me say what the Christianity question was, because I'm concerned actually the YouTube viewers may not see the questions that are come through here. So the question about Christianity is about what's driving the positive and negative evaluations toward Christianity among both conservatives and progressives.
Okay, so while listening to Professor Warsher's presentation, I prepared this because I'm not an expert in politics or political science. So I thought it would be even nicer to cite one of the great papers I know. So this is a summary of a paper written by Jiyeon Hong and Christoph Beck. So they looked at the historical origin of the strong emotion against North Korea among conservatives and how that's related to major churches. So as you can see, maybe because many religious leaders have their orientation in North Korea, they don't like North Korea, and that turned into electoral outcome. So that I hope that explains the link between politics and Christianity. And I think that also speaks to the question of what determines political orientation in Korea, because North Korea has been one of the central issues that draws a line between progressive and conservative. But as Professor Yu said, issues like gender equality and environment, they grow a lot in its importance. So I think I should mention that one. And what I did in my study was to define what was to discuss a polarization based on issue consistency and try to associate it with effective polarization. But actually, I think that emotional attachment to important political leaders like President Park Chung-hee and Roh Moo-hyun, I think that's another one of the defining characters of Korean politics. And and personally, I think that can explain a lot of opinion polarization in Korea. And as for the question from Professor Inbok Ri, I don't know much about any longitudinal data set about effective polarization. But as far as I know, some polling organizations like Gallup, they tracked how people feel about these two former political leaders, President Park Chung-hee and President Roh Moo-hyun, and I think that can capture some of the aspect of effective polarization. And I think we need more research how much of the overall opinion polarization is driven by effective polarization, and whether which one is more important, issue-based issue consistency or effective polarization, which one is more important in explaining what's observed in Korea?
So I was interested in your answer on the views about Christianity. I always, from my perspective of observing the role of kind of Korean evangelical churches in the United States, I'd assume that there would be an attitude toward the U.S. component in the attitudes toward Christianity. So is that not correct, or is it, you know, in addition to the kind of North Korean story?
Well, if I may jump in here, the American missionaries in the late 19th century and the 20th century were not strongly associated with imperialism, as in the case of other countries in Latin America and so on. In fact, when Korea was annexed by Japan, a number of American missionaries tried to speak for Korea. So you don't have that negative association, you know, with the United States Christianity that you usually observe in other countries, given that history. And as Professor Lee mentioned, a lot of it is driven by the division of the peninsula and the fact that number of you know, Protestant ministers coming from North Korea, and to add another dimension to the story, the Catholic Church supported pro-democracy movement very strongly in the 70s and 80s. So it's not Christianity as a whole, actually, but different, you know, different parts of Christianity that are associated with political, you know, political parties. And even in the Protestant church, there were some factions who supported the military dictatorship, you know, having like a morning prayer session for General Chun Doo-hwan, for instance. But there were others who supported the pro-democracy movement as well. So it's not a simple picture in Korea on religion and politics. And to add to what Professor Yu said, I think, you know, Park Chung-hee's developmental dictatorship defines much of the emotional as well as ideological attachment that conservatives have in Korea. So there's anti-communism, of course, but there's also very strong sort of attachment to industrial policy, dirigistic economic you know, policy and so on. So in the economic, for the economic dimension, conservatism in Korea is not strongly associated with, you know, liberalism, the economic liberalism, the Wall Street, you know, Journal kind of philosophy. So, and on the other hand, on the progressive side, it's usually associated with President Kim Dae-jung and Roh Moo-hyun, as Professor Lee was referring to. And their policies were somewhat more similar to sort of like social democrats in Europe. So the you know, the label conservative and liberal or progressive in Korea have fairly different connotations when it gets to economic domain. That's, yeah, and yeah, that's what I add to that.
So can I add one more point? So in terms of the Christianity and the political ideology, I think, so the two reasons why conservative in Korea is, you know, strongly associated with sometimes Protestant is our first president after the independent from Japan was Lee Seung-man, who was educated in Nolan's very own institution, Princeton, and
Before
also
little before my time.
and so when I was in Vanderbilt, I learned that actually a lot of educational system that Korea actually adopted in early days after independence. The Peabody faculty at Vanderbilt, they came to Korea, and then they actually set the foundation for a lot of educational system in Korea. So, and also the U.S. missionaries that the one you have mentioned. So they also brought a lot of Koreans to be educated in the U.S. So if you look at the very first elite kind of class in the Korea after independence, they got this opportunity to be studied in the U.S. So I think that there is some socioeconomic factor as well that the people, a lot of conservative things, the foundations of Korea was really supported and built by the help from the U.S. So I think that's why a lot of conservatives have this attitude toward U.S. But what's really interesting is that in terms of gay marriage or women's right, I feel like the conservative in Korea, they are very selective in terms of what's a trend in U.S. in terms of adopting those attitudes. If that's not consistent with what they believe in U.S., I think that they have tried to really shut down those channels, and they are very selective in terms of adopting the ideology and opinions, and that's consistent with their prior beliefs.
Time for a few more questions if we have them. If not, can wrap up a bit early, I guess. Anybody else? Okay, this is a very good session. It's nice to have two papers that really talk to each other, so closely. Okay, well, we will see you all, U.S. people, tomorrow night, and see how the Korean people in there tomorrow morning. Thanks.